Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Persuasion chapter. So we are going to talk about in this chapter specific persuasion techniques that have been used and studied to help people induce compliance. Now, in order to distinguish a couple of things, I want to make sure that we talk about the difference between compliance, conformity, and obedience. So we're going to talk about compliance in this chapter. Compliance is when you're asked to do something. We've already talked a little bit about ideas of advertising and trying to convince somebody to believe or do something. Well, compliance has to do with that, right? If you have a specific request, for example, buy this or do this, right? So these are requests. They don't have to be done, right? Nobody's going to arrest you if you don't. These are just requests. Conformity, on the other hand, we'll talk about in a next chapter. Conformity is when you just conform to what other people are doing, right? You follow what other people are doing, not necessarily because you're being asked one way or the other, just because that is, what to do. And obedience is when you're particularly commanded to do something, right? You're given an order, and then you obey or you disobey that particular order. So compliance and obedience sound similar, but compliance, you should think about this in terms of like a sales pitch or somebody asking you to do something where it's obvious that you don't have to comply. It's up to you. It is your choice to do so. So under this, what we're going to talk about is several different compliance techniques and where they come from. But by compliance techniques, let's give some examples of compliance ideas. So it's saying yes to others' requests, not orders, requests. So how do police investigators get crime suspects to confess, right? They're given requests. You got to tell because nobody has to do that, right? How do car dealers sell their cars? How do charity organizations raise money? All of these are ideas of compliance. How do you get someone to do something for you? Most of the time, when you're thinking about asking somebody to do something, it's a compliance issue. They don't have to do it, but they might say yes, they might say no. All right, so let's talk about an idea of something that you might do for compliance. So for example, you might want somebody to give you a ride to the airport. Okay, so let's talk about that as an idea of a compliance that you might ask, or a request that you might have of somebody else. Now, what we'll do is we're going to talk about several different factors that might influence somebody to be more likely to give you a ride to the airport, for example. Let's start with the difference between an explicit request and an implicit request. So explicit request would be something like a direct request. It would say, hey, roommate, would you give me a ride to the airport on Saturday? That's pretty explicit. You're telling exactly what it is. Implicit, that's when you're not directly asking for it, but instead you are you're kind of hedging around. You're like, oh, I gotta go home for the weekend. Oh, but I don't have a car. Gosh, it's so expensive to pay an Uber to go to the airport. Well, I guess we'll have to see what happens. Hope you guys have a good time hanging out all day on Saturday. Okay, what you didn't explicitly ask for a ride to the airport, but you're hinting around it, right? I need to get to the airport. It's expensive to pay for an Uber. You have a car and I don't. You're implying that you would like them to give you a ride to the airport. Now, here's what we're going to do. I want you to watch this video, which is actually a recording of a phone call, and according to the YouTuber, this is a legitimate phone call that they received. So let's hear this, and we'll ask you a question. All right, in that phone call, was that implicit, explicit, or both? I would say that was probably both, right? So certainly we're implicit, right? You don't care, you wouldn't know if I was dead or alive. Okay, that's implying that she wants you to be more in touch. And then at the end she asks, hey, if you have the chance, give me a phone call. That would be the explicit part. So the implicit part is when the mom is saying, oh, you wouldn't know if I was alive or dead because I never talked to you. There's no explicit request to call her, but it's pretty implied. And then at the end, she does explicitly say, give me a call. All right, let's talk about using appropriate language as a form of a compliance technique. Now, appropriate language, I'm not talking about swearing versus not swearing. That's not what I'm discussing. I'm talking about specifics of the way that you frame the actual request. And most of the stuff that we're talking about here is Langer and her colleagues in 1978. This is a classic study in social psychology. It's really an interesting one. Now, but to back this up, I need to make sure that I remind you of what life was like years ago. There used to be these places called libraries, and people actually went there. So, for example, if you wanted to find a journal article in psychology, you actually had to go to the library. And then when you got to the library, you'd have to look up the article. And when you had the article, normally with periodicals, you couldn't check them out, right? Normally with periodicals, you don't check those out. So you would have to make a photocopy. Well, that meant that there are sometimes long lines for photocopiers. So in this particular case, Langer and her colleagues were looking at the idea of making a request of somebody to cut in line for the photocopier. So what you would do is you would wait in line, you got to pay your money, however many cents per sheet of paper, make your photocopies, and the next person does it. So often there were lines at the library. So here's what they did. They had people who were Confederates. Confederates means somebody who's in on the study, right? So it's actually a research assistant who's acting like a normal person. And this Confederate would go up to the person who is in front of them and say, excuse me, can I use the copier? I have 5 pages. May I use the Xerox machine? Now, they used to call all photocopiers Xerox machines. Just that's why it says that. Anyway, so the first condition is they would say, hey, excuse me, I have five pages. May I use the Xerox machine? Even though it wasn't their turn. The second, and then we'll talk about a third in just a second. The second was, excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the Xerox machine because I'm in a rush? Okay. Now, let's look at the results of who complied to the request. How many people complied to the request? So this is the percentage. This is the percentage of compliance. So about 60% of the people, when you said, hey, excuse me, I have 5 pages, can I use the Xerox machine? About 60% would say, oh, okay, and let the researcher cut in line. But when they were given a reason, now in this case, this reason is not very good because I'm in a rush. That's not a very good reason. I'm in a rush, yeah, so what? You're in a rush. We're all in a rush, right? So what does that have to do with it? In this particular case, though, it was in the 90s, right? It was close to 90% when people were said, hey, can I use the copies? I'm in a rush. When they were given a reason, even though the reason's kind of stupid, the person was more likely to comply. Now, what about this? There was a third condition. May I use the Xerox machine because I'm in a rush? That's one thing. But what if they said, I have 5 pages. May I use the Xerox machine because I have to make copies? Do you think there was more or less compliance between the second and the third, right? Is there more or less compliance between I have to make, can I use the Xerox machine because I'm in a rush versus may I use the Xerox machine because I have to make copies? There was a negligible difference. It's like a 1% difference, like 93 compared to 92%. It's really, really close. When people are given a reason, they tend to be more likely to comply. Oh, you need to, okay, right? They're given a reason. They're like, oh, I see. There's a reason why you want to cut in line. Even though the reason is pretty lame, they are given, they are more likely to comply. All right. So when we're talking about asking for compliance, make sure you use the right language. And in this particular case, Langer and her colleagues found that this was based off of ideas of having a reason, giving a reason for why you want what you want. Even if it's a lame reason, it still is more helpful than not having a reason. Now, would there be a difference for a larger request versus a smaller request? In that same study by Langer in 1978, they had different requests. So what they would do is they'd actually ask different things depending on how many copies the person in front of them needed to make. So it was either 5 copies or it was 20 copies. So if somebody had to make 20 copies and you're asking to cut in line for 5, that's a bigger request than if somebody has 5 copies and you're cutting in line for 20, right? So what they found is that giving a reason still was more effective. Giving a reason was still more effective, even though sometimes that reason was kind of lame. Giving a reason was more effective than just asking outright. All right, let me ask you a question. We're going to get to a new concept here. New concept. Have you ever, it's your birthday and everything's going great, and then an acquaintance buys you a birthday present. So let's say that this birthday present is not like, a candy bar. It's not like $1. It's like, but let's say it was 20 bucks, right? It's something worth about $20. Do you like it if an acquaintance buys you, this is not a close friend, this is an acquaintance, just someone you know relatively well, okay? What would they bought you a present? How would you feel? Now, a lot of people say that they would not feel great, even though they were given a present that they didn't expect. No, you're given a present. You're up one present. Shouldn't you feel great if you got a present? You should feel good about it. That's a great present. Hey, thanks. Happy birthday to me. That's good, right? Well, often we don't like it because we feel obligated when people give us presents. And isn't that strange? I mean, think about it. You got a present. Shouldn't you be happy about the present? But in reality, we feel obligated because, if this person buys me a present, what do they expect? Do they expect me to buy them a present on their, I don't even know when that person's birthday is. That kind of a thing is onerous to us because we as humans love reciprocity. The norm of reciprocity is if somebody does something for you, you feel obligated. It's a norm. It's what you're supposed to do is reciprocate. And when people have compliance that they want you to buy something or do something, they will often use this norm of reciprocity. So let's show you a couple of ways that this might work. Have you ever watched a commercial and in the commercial they're like, hey, that's not all. If you buy this, I will give you this, and also this, and also this. Let's watch an example of it right now. So in the example that we watched, you watched a commercial and like, hey, that's not all. You can also get, free delivery. Oh, that's not all. You also get this free whatever, and also this, vacuum thing. We're going to give you all this stuff. Now, how is that a norm of reciprocity? Well, what's going on here is the idea that, hey, if I'm giving you more stuff, I'm giving. So each of those things is a little gift. Oh, I'll also include this, and I'll also include this. Each inclusion is a gift. And each time you're like, oh, they're giving me this. Oh, they're giving me this. Oh, they're giving me this. I should pay for that. I should give them money because they're being so nice and they're giving me gifts. So in this particular case, the reciprocity is if I add things in, it makes you feel like I'm giving you something. Now, a lot of you are like, well, wait a minute. Doesn't that just make it feel like I'm getting a good deal because I'm getting this and for a lower price because I'm getting more stuff? Well, think about it. You're actually getting the carpet or whatever the product is at the normal price, and then they're giving you these add-ons. They're giving you these extra gifts, right? Those are the things that are given to you, and it induces a form of reciprocity, a need for reciprocity. It is true that you're getting the total at a cheaper price, but you didn't necessarily go in there looking for an extra steam cleaner for the carpet when you're buying the carpet. That's the idea with reciprocity in the that's not all technique. One way that you often see this is through charitable campaigns. So there was an actual study done by a group called the Disabled American Veterans. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen the junk mail where people solicit donations, and sometimes they put in little like stickers with your address label on it. You know what I'm talking about? Well, it turns out that if you mail somebody an appeal for donations, normally, according to the Disabled American Veterans, in this particular case, the response rate was about 18% of the people actually did donate without any form of a gift. But it became 35% if they were given the request and they were given a gift. So it can be a very, very simple gift, like, for example, address labels. Address labels cost what, like 5 cents to print those out and give them out, and 35% they're not donating 35 cents a piece. What they're doing is that's 35% of the people who are giving a donation to this particular charity. The idea is, if we give you something simple, a free gift, even as simple as address labels, it makes you feel, oh boy, now I feel like I want to give them something, a norm of reciprocity. There's another way that the norm of reciprocity can be used. Now, I want to talk to you about the door in the face technique. So we're going to be talking about the door in the face and the foot in the door, right? So I know there's lots of doors and there's lots of faces and foots and body parts, whatever is going on, right? We need to make sure we distinguish them because they are not the same thing. The door in the face is not the same thing as the foot in the door. Those are very different things, very different. This comes from the ideas of like a door-to-door salesman, somebody who's knocking on doors and selling like a vacuum, for example. And what they found is that there's something called the door in the face technique. The door in the face technique, the salesperson wants you to slam the door in their face or start closing the door, right? Meaning they want you to say no to their request. Now, much of this stuff, by the way, is done by a researcher named Cialdini, and his influence book is one of the most famous ones in terms of compliance techniques for salespeople and other places. So Cialdini's done several studies on this and others as well. So, for example, a door in the face technique, there was a study that was done where researchers would come in and they'd say, hey, can we put this big sign, imagine like a 5 by 5 foot sign, in your front yard so that people can know that they're supposed to, and I can't remember exactly what the message was on it, but the request was, can we put this sign in your yard? And almost everybody said, no, we're not gonna do that one. And then they're like, oh, okay. Well, then would you be willing to put this little placard, this little sign in your window instead? And people are much more likely to say yes to that. Conversely, another study was done where people went around and they said, hey, would you be willing to donate 5 hours a week to this club where we help underprivileged children? And this is at a college campus, and most often people would say, no, I'm not going to do that. That's 5 hours a week. It's just too much. And then they'd say, oh, well, then would you be willing to just come this Saturday and help chaperone our trip to the zoo? People were much more likely to say that they would chaperone the trip to the zoo if it was first asked for them to donate 5 hours a week for the rest of the semester. If they just went up and said, hey, would you come chaperone for this Saturday, they were much more likely to say no. The door in the face technique says that you are more likely to say yes after you have said no. So let's watch a video about this. So what we just watched was a video about haggling, right? Haggling is, discussing price. Now in this case, the YouTuber is trying to show, how good of a haggler he is. I think I'm insinuating that. But in reality, think about it. Did he want to buy a watch? He just told you he just wanted to buy he just bought a watch. He doesn't need another watch. So why would he buy that watch? Well, the answer is because door in the face. The person said, hey, buy this watch for, 1,000 rupees, whatever it was. And then he said, no, I'm not going to do that. How about a little bit less? And then finally he complied and bought the watch. So he actually did do what he had been asked to do in this particular case. That was a door in the face technique. So is door in the face a form of reciprocity? The answer is yes. The door in the face is a form of reciprocity. At least in theory, what they're saying is every time you lessen your request, it actually is seen as a gift, right? Oh, well, gosh, I'll lower the price. How about instead you pay me 500 rupees? Oh, okay, everyone pay me 400. And then you feel like you need to reciprocate. You feel like you need to do the opposite and actually buy it. Conversely, if somebody asks you for a big request and you say no, and then they say, oh, well, instead, would you just donate 5 hours this coming Saturday instead of 5 hours a week? You see that as a gift, right? Oh, well, you really wanted every day. That's nice of you to make that concession. You've given me a gift, and I feel like I need to reciprocate, and so therefore I will also reciprocate and do something that you want for me. Okay, let's think about this in terms of if I need a ride to the airport. How could I do this? So first, give me an example of using give me an example of language of how you would phrase the request. So in this particular case, you should give a reason. Oh, would you give me a ride to the airport? I really need to get there on time. Or would you give me the ride to the airport? I really need to I need to save money for my grandma. Whatever it is, you give a reason. You don't just ask for it, you give a reason. Okay, what would be an example of getting a ride to the airport using the that's not all? So using that's not all, you'd say, hey, would you give me a ride to the airport? And if you do, I will. And so you've got to offer them something. That's not all. If you ride in the airport, I promise that I will do the dishes or whatever, right? So you got to give them something more. And so that's not all. If you do this, and I will do this, 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 and this. All right? Okay, how would you use the idea of reciprocity for getting a ride to the airport? If you give me the ride to the airport, so here the real issue with reciprocity is you gotta think of this as not as a bribe, right? So you're not gonna say, hey, I'll slip you 20 bucks if you give me a ride to the airport. No, it's an idea of I will give you a gift and you look for something in return. So for example, you would do the dishes for your roommate. Oh, I did the dishes for you. Oh, that's so nice. Hey, would you mind giving me a ride to the airport? I really need a ride this Saturday. That would be a reciprocity. Specifically then, how would you use the door in the face technique for getting a ride to the airport? So in this case, you'd say, hey, you know what? I really need to go and visit my family in Chicago. Would you drive me to Chicago? And they're like, drive you to Chicago? No way. Oh, well, then would you drive me to the airport? That's how you would do the door in the face. You need to get shut down. You need them to say no for the first request and then say yes to a lesser request. All right. Thanks, everybody.